The Hypocrisy of the West, ladies and gentlemen, is not a polite book. It is not a book that seeks approval, balance, or diplomatic applause. It is a book written with clenched teeth and an unblinking stare, because politeness is a luxury Africa can no longer afford. It is an accusation, a carefully reasoned, historically grounded, and morally relentless against a Western order that has perfected the art of preaching virtue while practicing betrayal. At its core, the hypocrisy of the West exposes a single devastating contradiction. The West tells Africans to believe in democracy and change their systems, yet punishes them whenever they try to make it a reality. For decades, Africa has been lectured about good governance, lectured about institutions, good institutions, lectured about transparency, accountability, term limits, and free and fair elections. African leaders are summoned to conferences in DC, in Europe, in Asia, Russia, workshops, summits, and donor forums, where Western officials speak with the certainty of priests and the authority of judges. Whole elections, they say, respect the will of the people, build democratic cultures, change your systems. Africans listen, Africans vote, and Africans pay the price. Because when African voters finally speak clearly, when they vote out strongmen who have overstayed, who have looted the country, brutalized, and stagnated their own nations, the same West suddenly loses its voice. Or worse, it finds a new one, the language of stability, strategic interest, and constructive engagement. Ballots are ignored, corpses are downplayed, fraud is relabeled as irregularities, and dictators are congratulated. This is the hypocrisy the book dissects without mercy. In country after country in Africa, ladies and gentlemen, the pattern is the same. Opposition victories are annulled by force. Results are rewritten in the dead of night. Security forces fire into crowds. Protesters are hunted, imprisoned, or killed. Courts rubber-stamp theft. And the next morning, Western embassies issue statements carefully calibrated to offend no one in power, not to offend the elite. They note the results. They urge calm. They call on all parties as if the victim and the executioner share equal blame. Then they resume business as usual. Hypocrisy of the West names this for what it is, the legitimization of illegitimacy. And once power learns it can steal without consequence, it never stops stealing. The tragedy is not that Africa lacks democratic instincts. The tragedy is that those instincts have been systematically punished. When elections become rituals with predetermined results, citizens learn a brutal lesson. Voting is just theater, not power. Peaceful change is an illusion. The system is closed. The door is locked. This is where the book Hypocrisy of the West makes its most incendiary and uncomfortable argument. The one polite analysts avoid, the one point that analysts avoid, African migration is not an economic accident. It is a political outcome engineered by the West as double standards. Africans do not wake up one morning, ladies and gentlemen, eager to get lost in the Amazon jungles or forests. Neither do they wake up to get drowned in the Mediterranean or rot in Libyan detention camps. Africans do not casually abandon family, abandon language, abandon culture and dignity to gamble with death in the desert. They live because every internal path to change has been deliberately blocked. They live because ballots fail them, protests fail, courts fail, dialogue failed, and the international community, so-called the West, the same one that demanded reform, sided with those who made reform impossible. When the powerful refuse to listen to the votes, the powerless stop believing in staying. And so they leave. The hypocrisy of the West walks through the radar to project exactly this picture. A young graduate votes for change, for example. The vote is stolen. He protests peacefully. He is beaten. He mobilizes. He is arrested. He appeals to the world. The world shrugs. At some point, survivor replaces patriotism. The ocean, the desert, the jungle, these become exit roads from a system designed to crush hope. And then, with staggering cynicism, the West turns around and asks, why are they coming here? The hypocrisy of the West does not spare Western liberals, conservatives, or institutions. It argues that this hypocrisy is bipartisan, systemic, and deeply embedded. One administration speaks the language of human rights, while funding regimes that violate them. Another administration speaks the language of security, while arming governments, dictators that terrorize their own citizens. The rhetoric changes. The outcome doesn't. African lives remain negotiable. What makes Africa unique, ladies and gentlemen, in this moral failure is not suffering. Suffering exists everywhere, but selective enforcement. In some parts of the world, stolen elections trigger sanctions, isolation, even intervention. But in Africa, they trigger photo ops and diplomatic handshakes. The same West that can move swiftly and decisively when its interests are threatened suddenly when it comes to Africa become patient, cautious, and understanding when African democracies are strangled. This is not ignorance, it is policy. The book argues that Africa has become a laboratory for double standards, a place where principles are tested, bent, and discarded. Human rights are conditional. Democracy is optional. Justice is postponed indefinitely, and the justification is always the same. We must avoid chaos, they want us to believe. Yet chaos is precisely what this hypocrisy produces. Permanent instability masquerading as order. Perhaps the most corrosive damage the book insists is not economic or political but psychological. Western hypocrisy has destroyed trust. Trust in elections, trust in international law, trust in the very idea that moral language means anything at all. When young Africans see dictators rewarded and victims are forgotten, chased out, democracy ceases to inspire. It begins to look like a trap. This is why coups find applause where ballots found silence. This is why slogans of strong leadership gain traction. This is why cynicism spreads among the people. When democratic paths are closed, anti-democratic alternatives rush in to fill the void. The West, having helped discredit democracy, then expresses shock at its decline. The book does not pretend Africa is innocent. African leaders, it does not absolve local elites for their greed, brutality, and betrayal, but it refuses to accept the convenient lie that Africa's failures exist in isolation. Dictators do not survive on repression alone. They survive on Western recognition, on their aid, on security perhaps, on silence, on the quiet approval of those who know better but do nothing. In its most searing passages, the hypocrisy of the West turns the moral mirror outward. It asks Western readers to imagine a different world, one where their votes are ignored, their protests crushed, their killers congratulated, and their suffering explained away as complex as they do. How long, it asks, would they stay in their own countries? This is not a book that begs the West to save Africa. It is a book that demands the West stop destroying it while pretending to help. It calls for nothing revolutionary, only consistency. If democracy matters, defend it everywhere. If votes matter, respect them everywhere. If human rights matter, apply them without hierarchy. Until that happens, the hypocrisy of the West warns the crisis will not end. Migration will continue. Instability will deepen. Anger will harden. And the West will keep fighting the symptom of a disease it refuses to acknowledge. A disease called hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of the West, ladies and gentlemen, is ultimately a refusal to die politely. It strips away the comforting narratives and exposes the brutal arithmetic of power. When principles are selectively applied, they cease to be principles at all. And when democracy is betrayed, often enough, people stop trying to practice it. They start running. Africa's tragedy, the book concludes, is not that it failed democracy. It is that democracy was never allowed to fail honestly, only to be sabotaged, to be managed and buried under congratulatory press releases from the West. That is the charge, and it is not easily dismissed. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what you will find in my elaboration, in my narrative in the book, The Hypocrisy of the West.
In this book, The Hypocrisy of the West, veteran journalist Chris Anu exposes the double standards that define modern global politics. From Africa to the Middle East and beyond, Western powers present themselves as champions of freedom while quietly propping up tyranny in the name of stability and strategic interest. This book pulls back the curtain, why dictators are rewarded after rigged elections.